Hello everybody, thank you so much for coming along and welcome to the Elemental Digital Festival, focusing on renewable energy. Elemental is the community for professionals immersed in the world of heat, water, air and energy. I'm Dhruti Shah and I'm today's host for our session on renewable energy and older buildings. Now, historical buildings and older properties can often be pathways to the past, but that doesn't mean it's cheap to keep them warm. So how should generating energy in older homes and other buildings, particularly for listed buildings or those in an area of historic interest, be handled? This session is going to look at some practical examples of achieving energy efficiency with renewable energy generation in older properties in a sensitive, sustainable and successful way. Now, please note that this is a CPD accredited session, so please do log those hours, and here are our learning objectives. So, by the end of this webinar, we aim to equip our attendees with an understanding of the challenges and obstacles facing those who are looking to reduce energy use and generate their own in older buildings. Attendees will hear about the potential renewable technologies that can be specified and what building owners will need to consider when assessing their older building stock. The session will also include discussion. I'm so excited to talk about this. The session will also include discussion of churches as well as listed and historic buildings. Now, let me introduce you to our brilliant panelists. We have Professor Alison Walker, Director of the Centre for Doctoral Training in New and Sustainable Photovoltaics at the University of Bath's Department of Physics. Take a breath there. Bob Wilson of Bob Wilson Consultancy, and who is also Project Manager or an advisor for more than 60 churches. Brian Cuthbertson, Head of Environment and Sustainability, Diocese of London, and Dr. Robin Pender, Senior Building Conservator. Again, I'm so excited about this. Sorry,
they're ridiculously long titles.
It's a very long title, but we're going to make sure we get it out there. So it's Dr. Robin Pender, Senior Building Conservation Advisor, Historic Building Climate Change Adaptation Team at Historic England. Have I got it right there?
Yeah.
So thank you all very much for coming along. I mean, I've given you very, very brief introductions, but I'm really interested, and I think our audience is too, in terms of what your roles actually entail. So I'd very much like to get you to introduce yourselves and tell us a little bit more about your experiences with older homes and historic buildings. So, Alison, can I go with you first, please?
Oh, okay. Well, I'm a professor of physics, and my research interests are in newfangled devices, and such as solar cells. And indeed, I'm director of a large postgraduate training network funded by the UK to train students in solar cells or all manner of research. And the reason I'm here is because the students and I should say the students are from 7 different universities in the UK, and with the enthusiastic collaboration of the Bath Abbey Footprint Project, we went up and looked at where we could put the cells, climbed up the tower and went on the roof to establish how solar cells would be mounted. We got plans and worked out what the effects of putting solar cell power on the building were, and we published a paper on that a year ago. It's on my website if anyone's curious.
Oh, fantastic. That sounds very, very exciting. So a lot of field work involved as well, it seems, in what you do. Brilliant. And Bob, how about you? Can I find out a little bit more about what your job actually entails?
Yeah, I'm an independent consultant. I'm a chartered building surveyor and project manager. I've worked in a number of sectors, but really since the late 1990s, all I've done is specialise in ecclesiastical buildings, church buildings of one sort or another. A number of vicarages, but not too many. I prefer the historic buildings, to be honest. And I currently look after more than 60 as quinquennial inspector, and a number more than that in terms of general advice. And it's a very fascinating but quite narrow field. So I will be able to bring some things to this meeting, but I'm sure others will have a broader view which might appeal more to our audience, but we'll see.
That's fantastic. Audience, we do want to hear questions from you. Like, we definitely want to find out what you're looking for. And Bob, that's a lot of different projects basically to have to manage. Lots of tabs, I guess, and lots of spreadsheets maybe.
Yes, definitely.
Fantastic. And Brian, how about you? Can we find out a little bit more about what your job title actually involves?
Yes, good afternoon. I work for the Church of England, and specifically the Diocese of London, which covers, it doesn't actually cover all of Greater London, it's about half. But we have 470 something churches and a similar number of houses, and also about 160 schools, and of course the Paul's Cathedral. The houses, the schools and the cathedral are managed by different teams, although I engage with them. But my direct involvement is more with churches. and encouraging them to and supporting them in developing works to their buildings which improve their energy performance and also install low energy technologies such as photovoltaic cells when that's feasible to do that. The sort of projects that can be involved are very diverse because they can involve work to the fabric, in installing insulation, for example, or to the lighting, LED lighting, and the electrics, solar panels on the roof, new heating. So there's a very wide diversity of different projects, and there are usually quite a few of them going on at a time. I also have some responsibility at the national level of the Church of England, because I was involved in the setting up of the church's national measuring scheme for its buildings, called the Energy Footprint Toolkit, and I provided support for that since it was created, and I still do.
Fantastic. I think we might have a slight technical glitch there, Brian. Just you're sort of off camera now, but that's fine. I think we all heard you, and we all heard a lot. I was very interested in finding out more about the energy footprint tool. So if you're able to get back on camera, that's cool. If not, that's okay. We can still, as long as we can still hear you, that's the key thing.
I can see my own picture, Judy.
Okay. Am I the only one who can't see Brian at the
No,
moment?
I can't either. He
Well, that's strange. I can see myself, so I've no control over that, I'm afraid.
Okay, well, as long as we can hear you, that's the key thing. And Robin, do you want to let us know what, Dr. Robin Pender, let us know what you're up to?
Well, I'm another physicist. Yes, physicists are really okay. And I work in the technical conservation department at Historic England. And of course, Historic England is the government advisor for all aspects of the historic environment. My expertise is in building performance. So that's all aspects of how building envelopes work, how they interact with their environment, and most importantly, how they interact with the people using the buildings. And I started off on that path more than 30 years ago when I came over from Australia to study wall painting conservation, and pretty much immediately got involved in working out how you might assess the environments of historic buildings, especially churches. We seem to be doing a lot of churches today, but they're a good sort of all-rounder. For the past 20 years, I've been concentrating mostly on climate change and working at HE and on their practical building conservation book series. That gave me this wonderful privilege of working with a lot of historians and seeing how the history of the built environment, how it's made, how it's used, is all bound up with the availability of energy, because historic isn't a synonym for old. So I often start my talks by putting up pictures of two Grade 1 listed buildings in London. One is St Paul's and the other is Lloyd's of London, and asking people to guess which one they think will be causing me the most heartache when it comes to climate change. And here's a clue, it isn't St Paul's. So I'm currently working with a group of researchers that include some really brilliant thermal physiologists who are working on human health and human comfort, to try and understand exactly why it is that we use so much energy in our buildings now, which they didn't in the past. Because if we start to untangle things, it seems the problems aren't sitting where we've been assuming they were sitting. So I'm not a technical expert in renewables, and I'm not a planner either, but I do have a bit of planning experience with appraising things like renewables, because I spent 12 years as a commissioner on the CFC, and that's the body that gives permissions for works to the English cathedrals.
So we've got a wide breadth of knowledge then, a wide breadth of experience. I'm very, very grateful that you're all here, actually. I guess one of the first sort of questions that I was thinking about was very simple, but perhaps we should start with the basics. When it comes to energy use and older buildings, and as you say, there's a difference between historic and older, Robin, what are key lessons that our audience here should definitely be aware of? So in that respect, Bob, I'm actually going to go with you first, but I would like to hear from everybody on this one.
Okay. I think the starting point from I'm going to be very interested to hear Robin's feedback on the comfort issue, because I've got a few questions of my own for you on that. But my experience on the renewables in terms of the church buildings has been really quite broad, where I thought it was going to be narrow. So what I mean by that, the renewable technologies that I can look at are quite limited. I can't put a wind turbine on top of a Grade 1 listed church. And more than 25% of the churches I look after are Grade 1 listed. And there are many other forms of energy that I can't often access. Ground source heat pumps, I can't really do that in the middle of a churchyard that's got thousands of burials. It's just not possible. Some churches, even St Paul's Cathedral, I think, does have some ground source heat pumps, so it is possible through the building footprints at times, but not always. So in church buildings, from my experience point of view, those renewable technologies that are available tend to be around air source heat pumps, photovoltaic cells. There is the possibility for solar thermal, but there isn't really the demand for that in many of the church buildings that I'm looking at, and therefore it's quite limiting. Having said that, in London, for example, where we are looking at air source heat pumps, I'm even further challenged, because in the city, where we've just done one, for example, at St Andrew by the Wardrobe, the nearest building is about 10 feet away on all elevations, near enough, all the ones that matter anyway. So where I'm trying to put air source heat pump plant, I've got noise issues. I've got grade 1 listed fabric, which is in part medieval, part Wren, and part post-war. And those different fabrics all behave in very different ways to the sorts of technologies we're trying to integrate within the building. So that becomes quite complicated in what might have otherwise seemed a fairly simple situation. We also have lots of difficulties in relation to getting the necessary approvals. Church buildings in the Anglican sector and some others enjoy what we call ecclesiastical exemption from listed building controls, but there is a parallel system of faculty which is every bit as rigorous that we need to go through, and that really constrains what we can and can't do in a very wise way. It's not a problem, it's a good thing, but it helps focus our abilities in terms of what we can and can't do in these buildings. So renewable energy technologies that are available within my historic buildings, as it were, the church buildings, and I imagine some other larger format buildings, are not as broad as there might be in other situations. The biggest issue that I have struggled with in the early days of doing this sort of work was understanding and getting other people to understand that the way we use our buildings is probably more important than anything else we're going to talk about. So if you think of a church, I don't know, out in the wilds of somewhere, and it gets used for 1 hour on a Sunday morning, and the rest of the time it's closed, and it's grade 1 listed, you can't do very much with it. It's technically a very difficult situation. It's not practicable to be putting all of these wonderful technologies into that building when someone is only going to be there, and it's only a handful of people, and they're going to be there for an hour. They're better off having a warm cushion, a wool cushion to sit on, so that they're not in contact with a cold surface, and keep the coat on and a blanket on your knee, because frankly, that's going to be a more enjoyable experience and a more reasonable set of precautions that you can take to actually make the experience sensible. So how you use the building is quite different. If you're using it 24/7, or as I've got the church that St Andrew by the Wardrobe I mentioned a moment ago, that will be used 7 days a week, 8 in the morning till 7 at night. That means that I can look at the very different control methodologies for the heating. It looks and the energy consumption in various ways. I've got a lot more possibilities in terms of taking advantage of the technologies that are out there and the control systems that can make that very efficient. The other area, I'll finish on that one more area that is really challenging on historic buildings, and especially the listed ones, is that energy is great in terms of its generation. We can talk about that all day. But if we don't manage it, if we don't stop it leaking out through the windows or the roof or the front doors, we open the church doors at the beginning of a service because we want to welcome people in. And guess what? The heat is going out faster than the people are coming through the door. If we're not managing the building and trying to reduce drafts and keep the comfort in that way, we're on a losing battle right from the get-go.
Wow, so that's quite a lot to factor in, actually. Like, it's not about, let's just change a bit of heating or change. It's a lot of like behavior. It's a lot of trying to figure out as you say, the restrictions that there are. It feels like you have to be quite innovative in this field from listening to you already now, Bob. But yeah. I'm going to go in this respect, actually, I'm going to go to Robin now before I head to then Alison and then Brian. But Robin, picking up on
That's
what
quite tiny, yeah. It's what I was going to say. It picks up on what Bob said, because the biggest thing that the audience should be aware of is exactly what he said, that how is it that we're using the energy in the first place, because we want to cut that down as much as we can. And that's not just for churches, that's for all buildings, and it counts for lighting and water heating and pumps and all the other ways you use energy. But of course, everyone here is going to be thinking of the thermal comfort. And the thing that I'd like the audience to be aware of there is that air temperature is a red herring for comfort. In fact, only a very tiny percentage of the heat we lose from our bodies goes into the air. It's only a few percent indoors. Mostly we radiate it into the surrounding surfaces. And that's at least 65% of our heat loss. And if we're wearing light clothes or so, and we're surrounded by materials that are good at absorbing that radiated heat, it can be well over 80%. And you'll know that if you've ever sat next to a bare stone wall in a church. And it's actually really good this in summer. And we need to remember one of the other things that we need to have in the back of our minds all the time is that we are heading to a warmer climate. So the last thing we want to do to our buildings is cause overheating. So this is a really good effect in summer, or if you're in winter and you're working hard, when you're actually moving around, you need to lose some heat to stop from overheating. But if it's winter and you're not active, that makes you feel really cold, because your body pulls the blood back from the skin and the limbs to stop it being chilled too much for the heart and the brain. And that's why you feel so cold. In the past, before the thermometer was invented, people knew about this because they felt it. Now they've invented the thermometer and we forgot to listen to our bodies. And so what did people do beforehand to control it? And what they did was they just hung up radiant breaks. They hung up things like cloths and canopies and floor mats. They're all over the place. And we can see them all. If you go and Google something like medieval illumination interior, you'll see them all over the place. When you go and look in the National Gallery at the paintings of interiors, you'll see them all over the place. We thought they were decorative. They're not. They're there for a really practical reason. And they were used right up until the 18th century. And they're still used everywhere in the global south, where they, of course, have a very tiny carbon footprint because they try to do everything passively. And these thermal breaks work really well, and they cut drafts as well. They're not just one-trick ponies. But in churches, for instance, they often had curtains down the aisles. You sometimes still see that. They're performing triple duty. They're making the space smaller, but they're also meaning that you're not radiating beyond that curtain. In cold weather, you'd probably want to top them up with a little people heating, which they always used to do. And just like in very hot weather, you might want to add a fan or so. And of course, we do need to be thinking along those lines because the climate's getting hotter. But this people-centered heating and cooling is really something that we can actually do these days much better than they could in the past, much more safely, with things like electrical heaters and fans that they couldn't do in the past. So what we need to do is combine the best of both worlds to limit what we're using in energy, and then we can pick up the remainder in these renewables.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Robin. And Alison, I mean, we're looking at lessons from the past in terms of how to use that within the future. But in relation to what you do, is there synergy there, or are we very much forward thinking? What's going on there?
Well, both and I would say. So I'd actually like to pick up some points Bob was making. So the whole project started with the Bath Abbey Footprint Project contacting me to say, could we look at solar? And I said, funny you should ask, because I was highly educated and enthusiastic young people who would be delighted to do that. But this was a few years ago, because this project has gone over 5 cohorts of students. And what in the intervening time, what was to some extent just, well, let's see what's going on, scientific curiosity, has turned out to be a really viable way of generating power. Why? Because of the points that Bob was making. It's the usage, so Bath Abbey is fortunate that Bath has geothermal heating. So they use the geothermal waters to heat the building, because, as Bob pointed out, solar thermal isn't really viable on historic buildings. The other thing that we found out, and this was by dint of climbing the church tower once a year, was that the solar cells are not visible. There's so much prejudice with the grade 1, grade 2 listed buildings that the solar cells are just going to really make them look ugly. But people see solar cells on normal domestic, of course they're visible. But with a Bath Abbey, and the same with any of the churches, I'm sure I could be this point could be confirmed or denied by my fellow speakers. But it's tall. The only place you could see the Bath Abbey roof is from Beach Cliff, which is quite some distance away, and even then you need a pair of decent binoculars. The other thing is that churches, right? They're east-west. They're lined east-west, which means you've always got a south-facing roof, and that's really important. Solar cells are not that as efficient as you might think, and they need to be well aligned to absorb the power. And another point, again, referring to what Bob said, it's the use. That's what counts. Because they've got the heating, they need it for light. But you don't even need that much light, because the solar is generated during the day, and that's when the building is used. So all the stars, shall we say, are aligned. On top of that, we've got the recent developments with the COP 26, 27. We've got the Ukraine war making energy far more expensive, making supply chains much more problematic. And so solar is becoming absolutely critical to the energy contribution of the UK. And people say, well, it doesn't shine at night. It doesn't matter. There's ways of storing it. But in the Bath Abbey and other historic buildings, anyway, it doesn't matter, because they're used much less often in the evening.
Fantastic. And I'm going to bring Brian in. I mean, Brian, I'm presuming you've been climbing up quite a few church towers as well. I might be completely wrong here, but it'd be interesting to hear what you think the audience should be aware of. And then we've also started getting some audience questions in. So once we've had Brian speak, I'm going to sort of tap into those audience questions and see what we've got. Brian?
Yes, I have indeed climbed up a lot of church towers, and I can tell you that if it's a spiral staircase with a radius of about 15 or 16 inches, then coming back down again is the real challenge. And by the way, can you see me now? Because I've been fiddling and hoping that it might succeed in giving you my picture.
Unfortunately, I can't see you, unfortunately. I'm just checking with the other panelists.
Yeah, I've been in the setup page and everything, and I've done my best. Never mind, I'll carry on. There's a variety of thoughts which have been raised from those who've spoken already, and I'll try to address several of them. First of all, to answer a question in the chat about infrared heaters. And yes, this is one solution that is very well worth considering, but you do need to realise that they need to be the modern far infrared heaters rather than the more old-fashioned traditional infrared heaters which glow red and tend to burn your scalp. The newer far infrared heaters are much more efficient, and they are well worth considering in many buildings, sometimes in combination with a low level of background heat, either from a radiator-based system, so-called radiator-based system around the walls, or there are a variety of other alternatives, and hybrid systems for heating a church are sometimes the way to go. What people yes,
Brian, I'm just going to stop you for 1 second, just to pause you, in case anybody can't see the questions in the chat, because we've had that in the past. I'm just going to read it out and then get back into you. Is that all right? Just so that people are aware of. So in this instance, it's I'm hoping I'm pronounced this correctly. So Elliot Harker Dempsey, you're asking, my church uses infrared heaters, which I see sense in. It directs heat to occupants, and much less is lost to the high rafters. Is this still an advised solution for old buildings with large spaces? So Brian started to answer that, but Brian, do continue.
Yes, it can be. I would emphasise that every building is a one-off and needs to be considered according to its own characteristics. So there is no general, there's no system really which one can advise which would be the correct solution for any building that you might encounter. But sometimes that is one of the solutions that should be one of the options that should be considered. I'll say a little bit about heat pumps as well, but because obviously there's a strong movement for installing heat pumps at the moment. Again, they are not always suitable, and they work best if a building is heavily insulated, and or if it has underfloor heating, which can sometimes be done in a church. because at least then the heating coming up through the floor, at least it warms you before it travels on up into the rafters, as it's been described. There are various different kinds of heat pumps. There are ground source heat pumps, which involve boring a hole in the ground. This is very suitable for a modern housing estate because you can often lay out a horizontal array underneath, for example, a car parking area in a new build project. In a historic building, it's much more problematic, particularly for churches where there are likely to be archaeological remains. So we're tending to think in terms more of air source heat pumps, which unfortunately are less efficient, and they do involve a unit outside the building, attached to the wall or on the ground, maybe near to the back of the building, maybe near to the dustbins, where there's a part of the building which is less visibly intrusive. And I would comment to add to what Bob said earlier, because although churches are exempt from listed building consent and the faculty system substitutes for listed building consent, that's not the case with planning permission. So anything that affects the outside of a listed building does require planning permission, as well as requiring a faculty from the church. And this is important in relation to air source heat pumps, because it often isn't very easy to find a suitable place to put the external unit. Sometimes it can be hidden on a roof, sometimes it's around the back, as I say. It's also very relevant for solar panels. And as Alison said, in a building of quite exceptional importance like Bath Abbey, the fact that you may be able to hide the solar panels completely is really essential for putting solar panels on a building like that. And the same applies, for example, to Gloucester Cathedral, which has solar panels which are entirely hidden. And I believe they're being considered for, I don't know how far the project has got, but I believe they're being considered for the remarkable historic church of St Mary Redcliffe in Bristol, which also have parapets behind which you can hide solar panels. But in many churches, it's more difficult to hide them completely. And this is where the difficulty in getting planning permission arises. And the process of getting planning permission involves a balancing exercise, which balances public benefit against impact on a historic building or the setting of that historic building. And if you want to install solar panels which are visible, it will have some impact on that church and some visible impact on that church and on its setting. And that needs to be justified, and a very strong case needs to be made.
Sounds like a lot. Okay, I was going to say, this sounds like there are a lot of factors that everybody has to consider, including the aesthetics, including that right sort of fabric. Go ahead, Robin, if you've got to add to that.
Yes, I do, because when we talk about things like, for instance, solar PV on roofs and so, actually, we're not starting so much from the point of the aesthetics. That's less important to us than whether you've taken proper account of all the risks, because there are risks with this. There's fire risks, which are, of course, categorically important for buildings. You know, they need the wiring, and it's got to be able to. You've got to take into account the increased risk from what you're doing with all the supporting wiring and so forth. And the other one is the risk to the roof itself. So when we're watching things being put on roofs, what we're looking for is how it's being fixed. And so you've got this terribly difficult thing if you're fixing to a roof, and that doesn't matter. It's any roof. This would be for a modern roof as well, but for a building of great importance, this is really categorical. The roof has to do something. It has to keep the water out. You really have to be careful with that roof. That is the primary lid for your building. If your building gets damp, it's going to be really horrible, and it's going to be very impossible to get comfortable and so forth. And it's going to use a lot of energy, as well as the energy of fixing up what's gone wrong. So the primary thing is to make sure your roof is in very good condition before you start putting anything on it. And then when you put things on it, you have to be considering how you're going to do that in a way that won't endanger that roof's function or the function of the gutters and drains and so, because you've got a very different water shedding and so on. You've got to take that all into account. And that's what people will be looking for when you're applying for planning permission or faculty. We'll be looking for that sort of thing. And it's often really hard. It's really building dependent, because you might say, oh, we won't have any fixings into the roof. But then if there's we're getting increased storminess. If the lifts off and goes through the roof in that way, that ain't a win. So it's about that whole process of, first of all, showing that you know what to do with the energy you're generating, so that you've cut down waste in the building and you know what you're going to do with this particular energy, and then saying, this is how we're going to mitigate, or we understand all these risks, here they are, and this is how we're going to mitigate them. And one of the risks is risk to the aesthetic or whatever part of the fabric that has to be included. But the huge thing is all those functional risks. We'll be looking for that.
So there's a lot of nuance, it seems, in terms of like when you're approaching a project and having to be very bespoke with each individual building. So that's a perfect term, actually, holistic. On that note, I'm just going to go to another question that we've received from Luke, actually, which I've got in the question and answer box. Can I just remind the audience, please do ask questions, anything that's been bothering you for a bit, or that's coming up from what you're hearing right now. Put it into the Q&A or put it into the chat. We'll pick it up and make sure to try and get it answered. But from Luke, he's asking, there seems to be a lack of clear guidance for retrofit of insulation in solid walls, vapor barriers, breathable, etc. Does any of the panel have experience of this and can recommend guidance? Obviously, good insulation is needed in older buildings to enable...
No.
I was going to say enable...
It's not obvious. That's the whole point.
Okay, well, there you go, Luke.
This is a whole other topic. We can't tackle it in here where we're talking about renewables. But there's a lot on Historic England's website, in particular in our webinars, our Technical Tuesday and Climate Wednesday webinar series and so forth. But it goes back to what I was saying about the way you feel cold. We're presuming that we're heating the air. If we're not heating the air, we don't need to do anything with the insulation for a start. There are things that would be sensible. If we're talking churches, a lot of churches, the Victorians pulled off the renders and they pulled out the ceilings. They should go back. That sort of is a kind of, if you like, it's an insulation. It's keeping the building envelope working correctly, and that needs to go back. But in terms of taking a solid wall, it doesn't need insulation. That's a misunderstanding. U values are ridiculous. I'll be really blunt about that. The physics behind them is non-existent, and they are used to feed into models where the physics behind the models is pretty poor as well. But I'll stop there. That's a whole other ballgame. You can have me back to rant about that anytime you choose. But stop and go back to first principles and say, what is it we're trying to do in the building, and why do people feel uncomfortable? Why do they feel cold? Because the other thing, it's not an innocent thing to go adding insulation. For a start, the way you do it means that you add to the moisture risk of all buildings, all of them, and really increase that. So there's a real problem that you could make your building wet. And I don't mean condensation. I'm not worried about that. I'm worried about all the gutter leaks and plumbing leaks, and they'll get trapped. And then sorry, I'm still going off on my soapbox, so I'm going to stop there.
I can come in on that as well, if I may.
Go ahead, Brian.
Hello.
Yeah. Go ahead, Brian. We can hear you.
Good. I think I can supply you with the link later, to circulate to participants. A very helpful document called A Bristolian's Guide to Solid Wall Insulation, which is very vigorous on this subject. But to some extent, I share Robin's skepticism about wall insulation, and in particular, I'm concerned about the risk if insulating the walls of a house, for example, about what happens in a heat wave.
Yes.
Because it tends to be assumed that if you insulate the walls, that will protect you against the heat coming in during a heat wave, as well as protecting you against the heat leaving the building during the winter. Actually, the main reason why heat enters the building during the summer is because people do things like opening the windows in a heat wave on the sunny side of the house. And that enables all the hot air from outside to come into the house. And if the window doesn't have shutters or curtains, the solar radiation will come straight into the house. And then with your insulated walls, it will take days to get it out again.
Yeah,
so
we're already seeing that, aren't we, Brian?
We are already seeing that. And it is interesting to see the way this has been dealt with in countries that have more experience than we do of a really hot climate. If you look, for example, at the wind towers on buildings in the Middle East, in Dubai, for example, which are exploiting the convection of the air, which goes up through the wind tower and cools the surfaces of the inside of the walls and inside the building and enables your body to lose heat more easily. And also in the Mediterranean, houses with shutters on the outside, because even if you have the curtains closed in a heat wave on the inside of your house, the radiated heat from the sun can still come in through the windows, heat the curtains, and then that will be re-radiated into the interior of the house. So these are problems that not just for retrofitting old buildings, but for the design of new buildings, and there needs to be a revolution in the assumptions that we make in the UK about how new buildings, particularly new housing, are designed.
Yeah, absolutely. Couldn't agree more. I've got a series of webinars running at the moment, Lessons from the Global South, which looks at things like this, and that we're hoping to keep that going for a long time. I'll put the link into the chat.
I have to apologise, by the way. I think people are now starting to work on roofs just outside. So if any of that noise comes in, it's very meta in that respect. But on that note, we've got a question from LinkedIn, apparently, saying, would the panel like to see any changes in government policy or legislation to facilitate renewables on older buildings? So on that note, Alison, I'm going to go to you first. And then I'd, again, quite like to hear from the other members of the panel in respect to that.
Yes, that's a good question, and I'm glad it was asked. And let me just say that plenty of politicians from both sides of the house, I should say, who are really extolling renewables. So, but what they do need to do, the politicians, is invest in skills and the technology, because there isn't enough skills investment all around. This is for many years. And it was just raised a moment ago by Robin. You know, you need the solar panels. Suppose they come off roofs, and that could be dangerous. But there's new types of solar technology where the solar panels are much lighter and much easier to fix. I mean, the fact is that, as was pointed out, that Gloucester Cathedral have shown that solar panels work and they're not dangerous, and it would be very similar with Bath Abbey. But still, it would be much. I think we'd all feel a lot happier if you could replace the solar panels by much lighter ones and ones which are more efficient, so you get less wiring and you've got all these issues. So please, government, whoever you are, please invest in the skills and science underpinning the renewables.
Can I come in at that point about solar panels again?
Yep, and then I would like to hear from Bob once you've done yours, Brian.
Okay, yes. One thing I would just comment on something you said, Alison, when you said that all churches have roofs point east-west and have roofs that face south. That isn't actually true in the UK. The churches are quite often orientated towards the east, not necessarily. So you do need to consider the orientation in deciding whether panels will be efficient. Sometimes, and there's a church just around the corner from where I live, because it has a very shallow pitched roof, they actually found it advantageous to put solar panels on both pitches of the roof, because when the sun's high in the sky, it can warm the other side as well as the side that's directly facing it. So that's on solar panels. On the orientation of the church, I've just put up guidance in the chat, a link to our guidance on solar panels, which comments on a number of the issues that Robin raised, as well as on that, and as well as on the issues around getting permission for the appearance of the installation from the local authority. And this is something which has become harder in recent years, incidentally, because of judicial reviews in 2015, not about solar panels, but about wind farms, because there's nothing a local authority likes worse than granting permission for something, being upheld at appeal by the planning inspector, and then being taken to the High Court for judicial review and losing its judicial review. And local authorities are very, very worried about this, and this makes them actually tougher than they would probably want to be themselves, because they are mostly trying to encourage renewable energy installations because of their own climate change targets. Most of them are now aiming for net zero by 2030, so they're actually on our side but they do have problems with the issues around historic buildings.
Yeah, and they have the 12 years of austerity and not the resources to do anything but sometimes
That
say
doesn't
no.
help.
Oh, I think that's a fair point. But Bob, if you want to come in on the legislation, and then it'd be really interesting actually to hear about how are you funding it, like all of you again, how can this actually all be funded? So maybe we can segue into that as well, Bob, from the legislation.
Okay, so a couple of points on the legislation side of it. Alison made the comment about being informed on a skills basis, and I'd very much echo that. What we get at the moment, however, is that there are lobbies. People are lobbying because they're making air conditioning units or whatever. They're lobbying because they're making fire detection systems or whatever. And they're coming from a different place from the need. Their need is to sell their equipment. It's not the skills that Alison was talking about. To be informed by professionals like Alison and Robin, who actually understand the bigger picture and the impact that some of these things has in areas that the manufacturers might not be aware of. So,
or interested in.
Or interested in, indeed. And then the other area, from a government point of view, we have, and not just churches, we have many historic buildings. They are our heritage, and they cost an awful lot to look after. They're not easy, but there isn't really much help. For churches, there's the listed places of worship grant scheme. That's we've been fighting for that for many years, and that's still there, thankfully. But there are so many other areas that we suffer a burden when we're trying to look after our historic buildings. And I'd love to see a system whereby the government recognised that and helped to a greater degree. Other countries in Europe, France are better at looking after their heritage. Germany, I think, are better at looking after heritage in financial terms from a government level. And I'd like to see more done in that way.
Especially since the single biggest thing for energy efficiency is maintenance.
Indeed.
And there is absolutely no help for maintenance.
Yeah.
Which is shocking.
The big difference between the UK and France, at least in relation to churches, and I suspect other historic buildings, is that in France they tend to be owned by the state. Whereas in the UK they are owned by actually a multitude of individual parochial church councils. People tend to assume in the UK that the church is rolling in money and that it has vast estates from which it's making more money than it knows what to do with. But this does not really correspond to reality.
We've got some fact checking there. That, to be honest with you, I was like thinking, oh, maybe that's partly why I wanted to ask the money question in terms of where is this all coming from? Like, how do you actually fund renewable energy projects when it comes to these older buildings? And Alison, you've got that pencil up. Go ahead.
Yeah. Well, basically, we showed in our paper that the solar cells will generate their own funds, because even nowadays, and we get more efficient with further research. We showed in this paper. I'll put the link in the chat. That because especially this was before the energy costs shot up. That they easily pay for themselves, because you can feed the solar power back into the grid.
It doesn't take years,
and that would cover them. So and that we did our estimates of, I think, made some estimates for the, costs of installing them and so on. Obviously, that quite rightly made that's important, and maintaining and so on. But still, they save money.
Alison, was that paper before the termination of new entries to the feed-in tariff and the beginning of the smart export guarantee?
So, sorry, I just couldn't hear that.
Well, I was wondering whether your paper took account of the fact that the feed-in tariff was replaced by the smart export guarantee.
Yes, it did take that into account. Yeah,
because
indeed.
the payment that you receive under the smart export guarantee is derisory. Actually, it's very small, and it does not represent the true cost of the energy. And the important takeaway from that is that, as well as installing solar panels, one should also be installing battery storage in many cases, so that you can use the energy yourself at times when the sun is not shining, rather than exporting it to the grid at a loss. But nevertheless, what you say is true, that it does pay back. Before the explosion in energy costs, solar panels were already paying back in 10 to 15 years. and now that payback time would have reduced considerably, and the capital cost of the installation in the first case has reduced. And also in housing, you don't pay VAT on solar panels. I think it should say, whereas in other buildings you still do have to pay the VAT. So that
even on the maintenance.
Yes, and that affects the calculation.
Shocking.
But we've got the you're saying that it's in the link, the project, Alison, you put it in. So
well, I'm sorry, I've just given one link, which is actually to a solar commission, which goes back to 2019, which I chaired, which is a general overview of solar power at that time, which is still largely holds. But I'm going to put in another link, which is to the actual paper that we wrote.
Fantastic. On that note, I was going to ask, although Robin, you can step in, but I'm just going to raise the question so at least people can think about it.
Well, I was thinking about the financial things again. It goes back to this holistic point of view. If what you do is not just think about the renewables independently, but if you're thinking about doing that whole understanding of how your building runs, cutting down the waste, understanding why you're using energy and saying, can we do this in a different way? Then all of that ends up delivering a building that costs very little to run. And actually, it's right all round. It means that the building is less likely to be damaged, so you don't have maintenance things as much as well. And everyone's comfortable as well, much more comfortable than they would be. It all feeds into the centre. And there's one of my American colleagues put this best, Mick Patterson. He said, we've forgotten how to sail our buildings and we need to learn it again. And I thought that's a beautiful analogy. The more you think about it, the more right it is. And where we need a lot of help, and from government and from the professions to take this on board, is to actually say, how do we teach people again to sail their buildings when, if you're talking about vernacular architecture somewhere in the global south, everybody still helps build the buildings. They know how they work. We've just forgotten. Nobody has a clue. It's like nobody has a clue how an LED light bulb works. In fact, I don't think most people understand how an incandescent light bulb works. And we have to build up that knowledge again so that people can really sail their own buildings for their own conditions and uses.
That ties in very nicely actually to the next question, and I'm just going to remind the audience we've got 10 minutes to go. So if you have got something that you're desperate to pick the brains of these esteemed colleagues, please let us know. But that's Ramin dipping in there. We'll get that in. I think that, but just a quick question in relation to what you were just saying, Robin. Was it via Elemental, was it difficult getting community support for the various solar PV projects on Bath and Gloucester Abbeys? So on one hand, we're talking about the knowledge, but on the other hand, the community, how involved is the community in these different projects that you've been working on?
Well, I was on the planning permission for Gloucester, of course, but they weren't the first cathedral to do it. The first cathedral, and the one that did it very best, was Bradford, where they reduced everything, every use of energy they could. They got the building into beautiful condition and then put in a wonderful proposal that sailed through years before Gloucester, actually. So it's in Gloucester too, they did a lot of work about showing that they tried to really understand their energy use and reduce it and match what they were doing to what they wanted to do in the cathedral. I think that's really important. That goes for all the things. It goes for ground source as well. So Manchester got permission to do ground source digging vertically, actually, to run their underfloor heating system. And that's then a very nice match. And of course, the underfloor is popular in cathedrals, which have these big stone floors where you radiate your heat into the floor and they neutralize the floor. That's why they work, not because they're heating the air. Something that a lot of services engineers don't get. They think they've got to get the air temperature on top of it. They might not need to.
That's helpful. And anybody else in terms of sort of that community engagement level?
Well, I just chip in here. There's a magazine, Bath Magazine, which is monthly and very much read by local citizens, including myself. And I got interviewed by one of their journalists who features regularly. And I think that's a good example of the community interest in these kind of topics. And as I said, it was actually the Bath Abbey footprint project that approached us rather than the other way around. And I sense a considerable interest and flexibility of thought around these issues. So yes, the short answer is yes, we got lots. And you can sense it. I mean, solar, as I call it, it's kind of cuddly, right? It's regarded as friendly.
And from the church perspective, the community engagement is vital to everything we do. The churches are there to serve their local communities. That consultation is it's rooted firmly in everything we do, whether it's renewable technologies or other matters. You know, if we're not doing it for the people that we're serving, then we're getting it wrong.
I think that's true for all buildings, don't you, Bob?
I do.
And just a very quick point, Ramin mentions in the chat about a product called SoulShare, and gives a little bit more information about SoulShare. But are there any other particular products that we should be aware of that are being quite innovative in the field that you're all in?
I would say that there's a forthcoming one from people like Burr, and so the Germans who make heated cushions and so, because the work that's been done on that by the thermal physiologists and so, it's stellar. It's amazing how helpful that is for people. And so there's something that's coming for all. It's easier to do it in your own house, actually. You can get them from Lakeland now. A bit harder in a church, especially if the church, it's easy enough if they've still got the pews. If they put up the pews and decided they just want freestanding furniture, then it's going to be a bit more tricky to get the people-centered heating. And I think that's one thing that congregations should think about, but also in your own house when you're thinking about how you do things, when you're thinking about how things will change in the future, and some of these innovative people heating things, which I think are going to now cascade in, because with the war and the price of energy, and it's not going to go down, it's only going to keep going up, then getting the energy where you want it, which is on you, not wafting about in your air, which gives you all sorts of additional problems, is going to be a winner. So watch that space.
Fantastic. And hopefully maybe, Alison, maybe some of your students will have something innovative that will be able to
yes, go for it. Yes. Encourage
not
them.
Not just the students. We've got the universities. We've also got quite a lot of firms on our advisory panel. And everyone is just so enthusiastic about solar. But what really pleased me was when I went on various Church of England websites and so on. I mean, I would say they're quite evangelistic about solar, if you don't mind me using that phrase. But it is. I mean, my relatives. It's just amazing how, and encouraging how popular it is.
Fantastic. Now we've got 5 minutes. I am going to do thank yous, but because we've got this sort of, if you've got like sort of one sentence that you want to make sure that the audience has as a takeaway in relation to renewable energy, older buildings, what would it be? I mean, we had it earlier, solar is cuddly. That was a very nice sort of soundbite. But I'm going to go to each of you to give us something, and then I'll do our goodbyes. I like hitting our time. So Brian, how about you?
Yes. The key thing, which we haven't really discussed in principle, is the need to get rid of using fossil fuels, gas and oil. And that's why we want to electrify our heating. And that's why one of the reasons why generating electricity, which you can then use to run an electrically powered heating system, and all that flows from that. And the same is true of heat pumps. You use electricity, and that electricity can be generated renewably. So
Brian, I like that long sentence. Bob, how about you?
I'll pick up from where Brian left off. Heating, if we're thinking of heating, why are we heating? What are we heating? You're either heating the people or you're heating the building, and they're not the same thing. Think about why you're doing what you're doing and make sure that the two work together harmoniously.
Alison?
Well, very much I concur with what's just been said. I think my take home is what we learned from doing this exercise. We started it before all this had really blown up in terms of need for energy and so on. And I think people have to exercise their curiosity and be willing to try new things, because on the face of it, you wouldn't have thought solar panels on a historic building could ever work. And sometimes it just pays to do a leap in the dark. Not literally, I says, joking, but you really do have to think Also thinking around, as has been stressed very nicely in this webinar, not just the actual power that's generated, the cost of fitting the panels and so on. That's incredibly important.
Fantastic. And Robin?
Stop obsessing about air temperature. It's not where the comfort is. That's a follow on from what Bob was saying.
I think those are all very, very important elements to factor in. See what I did there. I just want to say thank you all very much for coming along. Thank you to our panelists. Thank you to everyone who's joined. We're actually going to be writing up a roundup of the key messages from today's session. So if you're not already, please do follow us on LinkedIn, on our socials, and on our website, Elemental UK, for all of the latest updates. Once again, this is a CPD accredited session. You will also be able to watch back using the same link that you've joined in on. And once again, just to say to our brilliant panelists, Professor Alison Walker, Director of the Centre for Doctoral Training in New and Sustainable Photovoltaics at the University of Bath's Department of Physics, Bob Wilson of Bob Wilson Consultancy, and who is Project Manager or Advisor for more than 60 churches, Brian Cuthbertson, Head of Environment and Sustainability, Diocese of London, and Dr. Robin Pender, Senior Building Conservation Advisor, Historic Building, Climate Change Adaptation Team, Historic England. Got it there. Thank you so much for everybody. Thank you for this amazing and very engaged discussion. I've definitely learned a lot. And, I hope that the conversation continues. Thank you.
Thank you.